The crack of polymer fracturing under extreme pressure sounded like a gunshot in the quiet of the commander's quarters. Elias watched, his chest tight, as Kalen's obsidian-scaled hand closed entirely around the glowing datapad. Sparks hissed against her impenetrable grip, dying instantly. This was his transfer request. His one ticket off the obsidian wake. She didn't toss the ruined tech aside. She just let the fragmented pieces fall onto her desk, her golden eyes locking onto his with a sudden, suffocating heat that made the breath stall in his throat. It was a crushed transfer request that shattered a deadly misconception. But it hadn't started in this room. It started hours earlier, down in the lowest belly of the ship. The relentless thrum of the propulsion drives vibrated straight through Elias's heavy work boots. He spent his cycles down there, alone, recalibrating the secondary thrusters with grease staining his knuckles and the metallic taste of recycled air on his tongue. Truth is, the isolation of deep space is nothing compared to being the only human on a ship that fears you. When he finally had to walk through the communal corridors to retrieve a specialized optical wrench, the reality of his existence hit him all over again. He saw the subtle, immediate shifts in posture, the way the reptilian Viel crew, towering armored beings who conquered star systems, actively altered their routes just to avoid passing him too closely. A wide berth, averted, wary eyes. They didn't see an engineer. They saw something unnatural. Retreating to the solitary confines of his quarters, Elias had pulled up the ship's security logs. He needed to see what they saw. He watched the grainy footage from 3 cycles ago. The primary cargo bay doors failing. A 3-ton industrial payload plummeting directly toward a cluster of unaware Veil technicians. And then there was Elias. Moving faster than their visual receptors could track, he planted his boots and caught the descending mass. His muscles tore, his joints screamed under the impossible weight. But he held it just long enough for the technicians to scramble clear. Then he switched the log to the boarding raid. An outer airlock breached. Viel soldiers pinned down under heavy plasma fire. Elias hadn't paused to think. He manually wrenched the jam blast doors apart with his bare hands and waded into the raiders. It was violent. It was terrifyingly fast. He paused the projection, were staring at his own hands resting on his knees. They were scarred, calloused, and shaking slightly from phantom adrenaline. He didn't want to be a weapon. He just wanted to fix broken engines. And so he had finalized the transfer request, intending to leave before his presence caused any more friction. Which brought him to the threshold of Commander Kalen's quarters. He had walked in, the cold metal of the datapad heavy in his palm, and placed it squarely on her desk. He expected a curt nod, a formal dismissal from a leader glad to be rid of a volatile variable. Instead, she intercepted the device. Her claws dug in. The screen shattered. Now the ambient crimson light of her quarters caught the sharp, predatory angles of her jaw. Kalen stepped around her desk. She was an apex predator bred for command, enclosing the distance until she stood inches from him. Elias held his ground, his heart thudding violently against his ribs. He expected anger. But she didn't strike him. She leaned in, her proximity sending a static charge across his skin. She was close enough that he could feel the radiant, living warmth of her scales, the unspoken tension pulling the air out of the room. Kalen didn't back away. Instead, she raised her uninjured hand, her claws catching the ambient light, and flicked her wrist. The crimson illumination of her quarters dipped. A sprawling holographic projection flared to life, wrapping around them in cool blue light. It was the surveillance footage, the same feed Elias had obsessed over in his room. He watched himself tear the airlock doors apart. He watched the brutal, an uncalculated violence of his own hands as he neutralized the raiders. Elias looked away, unable to stomach the raw force of it, but Kaylin stepped directly into his line of sight. She didn't let him hide, and then she isolated a specific recording. The combat feed dissolved. The image shifted to the immediate aftermath in the lower hold. Elias was on his knees. His uniform was torn, his knuckles bruised and bleeding. But he wasn't fighting anymore. In the center of the debris, he was holding a rescued Veil fledgling. The projection magnified the moment. His massive, calloused fingers, the same ones that had just shattered armor, were moving with impossible, trembling gentleness. He was carefully wiping chemical residue from the terrified child's ridged brow, murmuring soft words the audio didn't catch. Kaylin watched the footage, and then her golden eyes locked back onto his. The space between them felt charged, heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. It turned out he had misunderstood everything. The wide berth in the corridors, the averted eyes. It hadn't been fear, it was deference. They didn't see a volatile variable. They saw a being capable of immense destruction who chose, in the absolute worst moments, to be gentle. With another precise gesture, Kaylin swept the recording away. The projection shifted entirely, pulling up a massive, rotating schematic of the ship's primary engine block. It was heavily modified, layered with access codes and authorizations that Elias didn't possess. At the top of the interface, the insignia for Chief Engineer glowed brightly, tethered directly to his personnel file. But she didn't let him study the schematics. When she deactivated the screen entirely, the room plunged back into the quiet, intimate red glow of her quarters. Kaylin reached out. She didn't hesitate. She took his bare, scarred hand in hers. Her grip was firm, her scales smooth against the heat of his skin. It was a grounding touch, an anchor in the vastness of the ship. He was transitioning from an outcast mechanic to an apex predator's chosen protector. Elias looked down at their joined hands, the ache of isolation draining out of his chest all at once. Slowly, deliberately, he curled his fingers inward, returning her grip. He felt her thumb sweep over his bruised knuckles. The transfer was dead. Cycles later, the rhythm of the ship had fundamentally changed. The engine room was still his sanctuary, but he no longer hid there. He walked the communal corridors with a different cadence, assuming his dual role with quiet confidence. He was the chief engineer, and he was Kaylin's designated partner. The Veil crew still parted for him, but now there were nods of deep respect. On the bridge, the hum of the ship felt different. Elias stood on the observation deck, the starlight washing over his face. He didn't stand alone. Kaylin stood shoulder to shoulder with him, their arms brushing as they oversaw the steady, unstoppable advance of the obsidian wake. He had finally found his place,